As predicted in our 40-minute analysis of Ole Gunnar Solskjaer's Molde side, which you can find a link to in the description below, he lined up with a 4-2-3-1 that becomes a 4-3-3 going forwards. We emphasised and predicted that Matic would be the more defensive of the three in midfield, and shield and slot in between the two centre-backs in Fernandinho fashion to allow both wing-backs to provide width, stretch the park and get forward to overload the opposition and stretch their defence. Something the wing-backs were restricted in doing under Jose Mourinho. There were times in the second half where Ashley Young would be in the Cardiff box unmarked, which emphasises how far forwards he was getting. We also predicted that Herrera, not Pogba like many thought, would be the deeper player alongside him, off the ball as a box-to-box midfielder who'll make late runs forwards behind the main man in Paul Pogba, who actually managed 3 whopping assists and probably would have got a goal as well had he have not given what should have been his penalty to Lingard instead. And Paul Pogba was, of course, the side's primary playmaker behind a lone striker, who in this case was Marcus Rashford, with Romelu Lukaku obviously not being available. Just as we also predicted, behind the main central striker, who was furthest forward, we'd see 2 narrow second strikers who interchange positions between each other, sometimes drift out wide when required, as opposed to being out-and-out wide players or wingers with major emphasis on tracking back and helping out a deep defence. And this was really what we saw a lot under Jose Mourinho. Sitting narrower means they can support the lone striker more and focus on scoring goals, as opposed to really being square pegs in round holes, and no longer need to worry about creating from the wide areas, as that's what the wing-backs are for. The style of play was direct, with an emphasis on getting the ball from back to front at a high tempo, leading to plenty of runs forwards from midfield to overload the opposition box, as expected, and resultantly, obviously, create goal-scoring opportunities. With increased freedom to run forwards when in possession, it was easier for United to pass the ball forward, as opposed to sideways or backwards, as they often resorted to doing under Mourinho. Players were also given extra encouragement to run at the opposition, for example, the way Lingard won his penalty, and shoot, for example, Herrera, with the help of a deflection, putting Man United 2-0 up with a great strike. Ultimately, the main difference was a change in mentality, again, as we predicted. Players were given a license to just roam and get forward more, and be more expressive, even if it meant being open to the counter-attack, and Solskjaer put his trust in his higher quality of players to get the job done against a Cardiff side that on paper probably has the weakest squad in the Premier League this season. Cardiff like to employ an old-fashioned tight man-oriented marking approach. The centre-backs try to stay tight to the strikers. Their defensive or central midfielders also look to track runners from midfield by jockeying them back to shield their defence and trying to get a tackle in when possible, and the fullbacks follow and stay tight to the opposition wide players, even in field. This in return expects their own wingers, as in the Cardiff wingers, to track any potential overlap out wide, and this played into United's hand, particularly as their overlapping wing-backs were very wide and Cardiff's fullbacks, you guessed it, were being drawn in field. This is the exact reason why this approach is old-fashioned, because given how the game has evolved, marking opponents tightly means that attackers can then start to define your defensive shape and as a result create space for themselves, which is why nowadays you tend to see most top clubs adopt more of a zonal marking approach. Against a top team, United can't get away as much with throwing the kitchen sink forward like they did against Cardiff, because teams with players like Leroy Sané or Mohamed Salah out wide on the counter-attack will be able to exploit Solskjaer's approach's weakness in the wide areas, and we discussed this when looking at his Molde side as well. However, against Cardiff, United themselves were able to exploit this form of tight marking with their own off-the-ball movement. Lingard and Martial, despite being those narrow strikers, would often drop into central midfield at times to pick the ball up off Matic or a centre-back. Now this seems kind of counterintuitive in theory, but what it would allow them to do is sometimes they would drag a fullback out of position, which would be the trigger for an Ashley Young or a Luke Shaw to then bomb forward on the overlap. Or a central midfield player to pick them up coming deep, and as a result you'd then end up with Herrera or Pogba having a trigger to basically push further forwards into the line between the Cardiff defence and midfield. So by these narrow strikers dropping deep to pick up the ball, you in return create space for your Pogba or Herrera. What this allowed them to do was not only retain possession because of the numerical advantage that they had centrally to pick the ball up off the centre-backs or off Matic to build an attack going forwards, but it also basically helped them carve out holes in the Cardiff deep defence. Using this sort of movement as a trigger for your wing-backs to push forward or for your central midfielders to push forward also means that when those players push into space, you then have a passing option, a forward passing option. Now, in order to reap the benefits of this approach, you need to be willing to throw players forwards. And under Mourinho, Herrera and Pogba just weren't able to make as many runs forward as they did against Cardiff for Solskjaer. And the same goes for the fullbacks or wingbacks as well, who, even when they're not directly involved in play, do actually play a part in stretching the opposition defence. The same old story of sacrificing defensive stability for offensive gain. Now, I'm going to stop here because the main key tactical points have been discussed, and I don't want the video being too long, particularly as this is the first time I use actual match screenshots in one of my analysis videos to kind of test the waters with copyright, so we'll see how that goes. The most significant difference from United so far isn't the formation they're playing or necessarily the tactical approach as such, but the movement from players both on the ball, in terms of transitioning men forward quickly, more aggressively, and off the ball in terms of players positioning off the ball, in terms of whose defensive duties are now what, and when closing down the opposition with a higher intensity. Which was also something that really we discussed in our 40-minute analysis of Solskjaer's Molde, and we saw glimpses of it. So in reality, the mentality as a whole has changed to prioritise attack and to just take risks in terms of trying to score and putting that as a priority above everything. There was a lot of emphasis post-match on the fact that United broke their record for distance run or something along those lines. Michael Owen seemed a bit of a fan of it, as you'd imagine, given Michael Owen punditry. I can't quite remember what it was, but really that's expected when players are being asked to basically get forward more. The greater runs forward of just purely Shaw and Young, as well as having to run back, because obviously they've run forwards, as funny as it might sound, alone will bring that average up. It's difficult to say for sure whether or not the numbers are down to players now apparently playing for the manager and giving more, or whether it is simply a natural byproduct of playing with a more attacking mentality and getting more players forward. After all, Solskjaer hasn't even been there long enough to really even change more than that. Overall, Cardiff are a team who have conceded 22 goals, scored 5 in their matches against the top 6 so far this season. They haven't exactly been solid both home nor away against teams in the top 6. The first free kick goal from Rashford, in the words of Neil Warnock, was Sunday League defending in terms of the wall. Even though you might be able to argue that Matic played a part in that, really if you're a Premier League defence, you shouldn't still allow that to happen or allow Matic to do what he supposedly did. The second goal was an unfortunate deflection, but it still makes you wonder who on earth should have been closing Herrera down in the first place, and then really the penalty was just rubbing salt in the wounds. United fans probably won't like hearing this. I'm not a United fan myself, but they won't be able to play the same way against better teams in the division. Otherwise, they will leave themselves exposed defensively. And for me, United have brought in Solskjaer at a good point in time, where, you know, their fixture list isn't too difficult and it gives him time to try and get the players familiar with what they have in mind. But for me, really, it's those kind of games against teams in the top six where we really start to judge Solskjaer's tactical acumen. However, considering United have lost to the likes of Brighton and West Ham this season, and even Derby County, United fans will probably be happy to concede average results against the big teams if it means at least beating the smaller teams that they should be beating. Playing attacking football the United way. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button and of course the subscribe button. Feel free to check out the longer in-depth 40-minute analysis of Solskjaer's Molde side. A link is in the description below. Or some of my other tactical analysis videos on my channel, including Pep Guardiola's Manchester City, Conte's Chelsea, Jose Mourinho's Man United, dare I say it. And I think until next time, as always, thanks for watching.